Korean Air, one of the largest and most well-known airlines in the world, is a symbol of South Korea's rise to economic power. With a global network of destinations and a reputation for exceptional service, Korean Air has become a leading player in the highly competitive airline industry.
There was a time when flying wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was an experience. Red stripes on polished metal, flight attendants in crisp uniforms, and passengers who dressed like they were heading to a gala instead of an airport. And in the middle of it all was TWA, Trans World Airlines, a name that once carried the kind of weight you only hear in legends now. This was the airline that defined what it meant to fly in style, helped shape the golden age of aviation, and for decades stood as a symbol of American ambition. But like so many giants of that era, its story ended in heartbreak. Welcome back to A Brief History, a series where I dive into the history of the most influential airlines and airplanes in aviation history. Today, we're looking back at the rise, the fall, and the lasting legacy of TWA, the airline that made flying glamorous. Transcontinental and Western Air, the carrier that would become TWA, was born from consolidation. On July 16, 1930, several smaller carriers were merged into Transcontinental and Western Air to create a single coast-to-coast operator capable of handling both airmail and scheduled passenger service. The merger was encouraged by the Postmaster General as Washington pushed to streamline airmail contracts into larger, more reliable carriers. Within months, the new airline began operating one of the earliest all-plane transcontinental schedules connecting New York to Los Angeles with multiple stops along the way. In the 1930s, TNWA marketed itself as a cutting-edge option for long-distance travel. The company quickly moved from small tri-motors and mixed-rail air services into more modern aircraft, notably the Douglas DC-2 and, beginning in 1937, the Douglas DC-3. The DC-3 in particular changed the economics of passenger flight. It was reliable and profitable, operating on passenger revenue alone, and it enabled TWA to offer faster, more regular transcontinental service, transforming air travel from an adventurous novelty into a practical way to cross the country. The mid-1930s also brought industry upheaval. The airmail scandal of 1934, which accused favoritism in airmail contract awards, and the resulting Airmail Act forced changes in airline ownership and government contracting that affected TWA's corporate structure and finances. The company weathered the shakeup but emerged in an environment where larger airlines and stronger leadership would become divisive competitive advantages. Howard Hughes' involvement marks the turning point from a strong domestic trunk carrier into a global, style-driven airline. Beginning in 1939 and consolidating control through purchases into the early 1940s, Hughes quietly accumulated a controlling stake in TWA, although he rarely held an official title. He exercised enormous influences, appointing directors, shaping strategy, and directly intervening in equipment decisions. Hughes saw an airline not merely as transport, but as a statement of technological excellence and glamour, and he pushed TWA to embody that vision. Hughes's most visible technical and marketing legacy was his role in the birth of the Lockheed Constellation. Dissatisfied with available designs, Hughes and TWA executives worked with Lockheed to create a fast, long-range, four-engine airliner tailored to TWA's transcontinental and transatlantic ambitions. Hughes helped finance and push the order for dozens of Constellations, and TWA used the Constellation to inaugurate long-range international services after World War II. The Constellation's sweeping lines and improved speed and comfort helped cement TWA's image as the era's glamorous airline. By the late 1940s, under Hughes's patronage with a modern fleet, TWA had transformed from a regional trunk line into a true transatlantic and global airline. Its combination of design-forward aircraft, high-service cabin culture, and ambitious route planning established the brand identity that decades of advertising would later celebrate. The red-striped airline that represented America's post-war optimism and the romance of flight. Those early choices set the stage for TWA's golden age and also planted seeds of capital intensity and strategic risk that would shape the airline's later fate. By the early 1960s, TWA had firmly cemented its place among the world's premier airlines. With a progressive fleet, global routes, and a brand built on style, it offered not just transportation, but an experience. One of the major markers of TWA's golden era was its swift jet age transition. On March 20, 1959, the airline began flying its Boeing 707 on the San Francisco to New York route, a clear signal that TWA was embracing the future of air travel. By 1967, TWA had retired its remaining constellations and became the first U.S. airline to go all-jet. That investment paid off. In 1963, TWA reported a net profit of $19.8 million. In 1964, profit rose to $37 million. In 1965, to $50.1 million. At the same time, TWA's reach across the globe expanded dramatically. By the late 1960s, TWA's transatlantic traffic had overtaken even the legendary Pan American World Airways. In 1969, TWA carried the most transatlantic passengers of any U.S. airline. And 1969 also saw TWA inaugurate trans-Pacific and round-the-world services. Beyond fleet and routes, the image of flying with TWA became deeply tied to mid-century chic and design. Its newly opened terminal at New York's TWA Flight Center, designed by pioneer architect Eero Saarinen in 1962, captured the bold optimism of the area. The curving, sweeping lines of the Flight Center symbolized flight itself, style, speed, and freedom. Inside, amenities such as in-flight motion pictures introduced by TWA in 1961 underscored how the airline wasn't just keeping pace with its competitors, it was setting the trends. Training and service excellence were also a part of the brand. TWA's Breach Academy, opened in 1969 in Overland Park, Kansas, became the definitive training ground for flight attendants, ticket agents, and pilots, a tangible demonstration of the airline's commitment to its passenger experience. And at its Kansas City overhaul base, opened in the 1950s and flourishing in the 1960s, TWA employed thousands of technicians servicing its fleet, setting industry standards for maintenance and operations. The 1970s began well for TWA. In February of 1970, the airline inaugurated domestic Boeing 747 services between Los Angeles and New York, making it the first U.S. carrier to offer 747 flights on a domestic route. While domestic travel was becoming more accessible, TWA maintained a level of prestige. Business class, ambassador service, debuted, and no smoking sections were introduced fleet-wide by July of 1970. Yet, beneath the shine, subtle signs of change were appearing. The cost of expanding international routes, maintaining a top-tier fleet, and keeping up with the rising demands and democratizing air travel markets meant that the model of glamour was under pressure. Airline travel was no longer exclusively for the elite, and the skies were getting more crowded and more competitive. Flashback to 1966. Howard Hughes, after decades of odd hands-on meddling and years of litigation over his control, was forced to sell his TWA stock. It returned him roughly $546.5 million and, more importantly, ended an era of the one-man stewardship. Almost immediately, the airline that had been run in large part as Hughes's personal project found itself in a different world. The man who had treated fleet purchases, liveries, and even route ambitions as personal crusades was gone, and with him, a blunt, if eccentric, strategic voice. In the absence of that centralized decision-making, TWA's leadership passed to trustees, bankers, and a rotating set of corporate executives who were far more conventional and, crucially, far less willing or able to underwrite the kinds of huge, long-term investments Hughes once had tolerated. That leadership change revealed an uncomfortable truth about big airline economics. Prestige costs money. The move to an all-jet fleet and the global route network that made TWA a household name were capital-intensive choices. New jets, more crewing, expanded overhaul facilities, and the infrastructure to support long-haul services created a high fixed cost base. Great for an era of rising demand, disastrous if demand stalled or operating costs spiked. TWA's balance sheet, once buffered by Hughes's appetite for investment, now showed how thin a margin separated glamour from vulnerability. The 1970s tested that vulnerability. The 1973 oil embargo and the resulting spike in fuel prices transformed airline math almost overnight. Fuel, already one of the airline's biggest expenses, became a runaway cost, squeezing profits and forcing carriers to rethink routes, capacities, and fares. For an airline whose brand premium relied on long-haul international flying and wide-body operations, the margin shock was especially painful. Every transatlantic crossing that once felt effortless now had dramatically higher operating costs attached. At the same time, the social and regulatory environment around aviation was shifting. The rise of mass travel diluted exclusivity. Passenger demographics were changing as airfares and the broader economy made flying accessible to millions more. Hijackings and heightened security concerns in the late 60s and 70s also added new operational costs and operational complexity across the industry. Meanwhile, policy discussions about liberalizing route and fare controls were already underway, introducing an extra layer of strategy uncertainty for legacy carriers that had built empires under a very different regulatory regime. Operationally, TWA increasingly faced the classic legacy carrier squeeze. High labor costs from the established contracts, expensive maintenance obligations for its large fleet, and the need to keep premium product standards while competitors began to undercut fares. The airline tried to preserve service and brand, but those moves only made the fixed cost problem more acute when revenues came under pressure. Corporate attempts at diversification in the 1970s signaled management searching for profit elsewhere, not always successfully. Outwardly, TWA still looked like the airline it had always been: polished, confident, international. The red stripes gleamed, the 747s still carried movie stars and business elites across the Atlantic, and the ads still promised up, up, and away. But inside, the company's balance sheets told a different story. The Hughes era's bold investments had turned into heavy obligations, and management's attention was stretched thin between operational realities and a shifting marketplace that was about to change forever. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 stripped away decades of government protection, forcing airlines to fight in a free market for the first time since the 1930s. Fares could now fluctuate with demand, routes were open to competition, and efficiency, not luxury, would determine who survived. For TWA, an airline built on full-service prestige, this new reality was brutal.
Right before your eyes, TWA is creating a brand new way for business flyers to fly coast to coast. A business class in a separate cabin with bigger, wider seats than in coach, but fewer seats so you're less crowded. It's TWA's new ambassador class to the East Coast, with enough room for anybody.
Even if you're 7'1" or taller, taller, little. You're gonna like us, TWA.
Through the early 1980s, TWA fought to adapt. It introduced fare sales, it trimmed routes, and modernized part of its fleets with Boeing 767s and 757s. But even as it evolved, the airline struggled under the weight of aging widebodies, volatile fuel prices, and a cost structure better suited for the era of government regulation. Competition from newer low-cost carriers and leaner legacy rivals like Delta and American began to bite into the market share. TWA still projected the image of a world-class international carrier, but the numbers behind the curtain were worsening and fast. In this climate, Carl Icahn saw opportunity. Icahn was a financier from Queens who had made a fortune in corporate takeovers during the 1980s, earning the label Corporate Raider. He'd already made headlines for buying, restructuring, and sometimes gutting companies for profit, and in 1985, TWA became his next target. That year, ECAN orchestrated a leveraged buyout of TWA valued at roughly $650 million. On paper, it looked like a bold rescue. ECAN promised investors he could turn the struggling airline around. In reality, the LBO loaded the company with enormous debt, forcing it to focus on paying back loans rather than competing in an increasingly ruthless market. Within 2 years, TWA's debt had ballooned to over $3.5 billion, and ECAN began aggressively cutting costs. Most famously, ECAN sold TWA's most profitable transatlantic routes, its crown jewels, to American Airlines in 1991 for $445 million. Those London Heathrow routes had been the pride of the airline since the 1950s, carrying more prestige and profit than nearly any other operation. Losing them gutted TWA's international network and permanently crippled its ability to compete globally. Internally, morale plummeted. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crews, many of whom had spent their entire careers with the airline, saw ECAN's move as a betrayal. Labor relations became toxic, strikes and lawsuits mounted. The once celebrated TWA culture of service and pride eroded under financial austerity and uncertainty. Maintenance standards remained safe and professional thanks to the airline's crews, but the reputation for luxury and polish that had defined TWA for decades began to fade. By the early 1990s, ECAN had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in fees and profits from TWA, even as the airline itself teetered on the brink. In 1993, he finally stepped down as chairman, leaving behind a company burdened by debt and stripped of its most valuable assets. Industry analysts at the time described the airline as a shell of its former self. After ECAN's departure, TWA attempted to rebuild under new leadership. The airline modernized its image with a refreshed livery and expanded domestic operations through its St. Louis hub, but it was too late. Deregulation had produced an era dominated by mega carriers with stronger balance sheets, and TWA no longer had the scale or cash to compete. What had once been an airline that symbolized freedom, adventure, and modernity had become a cautionary tale in corporate America, and soon tragedy and inevitably would finish what corporate greed had started. Even after the ECAN years, TWA staggered on, trying to rebuild, modernize, and survive. The 1990s were a fight for relevance. The airline restructured, changed leadership multiple times, and attempted to realign routes and hubs, but the structural damage was deep. The business that had once been built on long-term brand-driven investment was now weighed down by debt, shrinking margins, and the new economics of an industry that rewarded scale and efficiency above nostalgia and design. The decade brought both operational trouble and public tragedy. In 1996, the loss of Flight 800, a Boeing 747 that exploded off Long Island with 230 people aboard, delivered a blow that was emotional and reputational as much as operational. Investigations and speculations followed for years. The accident left a deep scar on the airline and its public perception. And by 2001, the story had reached its final chapter. American Airlines moved to acquire the remains of TWA, and the handover was complete in late 2001. During the transition, some aircraft briefly wore a hybrid paint scheme. American's tri-colored cheat stripe on the fuselage paired with TWA tiles and tail markings on certain airplanes, a small, visible reminder that a storied name was being folded into a bigger carrier. Booking under the TWA name ended on November 30th, 2001, and the ceremonial last flight and the physical removal of TWA signage were completed on December 1st, 2001. Not every program, order, or plan survived the takeover. In 1998, TWA had placed an order for 50 McDonnell Douglas MD-95s, later rebranded as the Boeing 717. After American acquired TWA, American initially considered continuing the order, but ultimately canceled the undelivered 717s. The 717 program itself continued in small production for other carriers until Boeing ended it in 2006. The aircraft that had been intended for TWA were absorbed elsewhere, delivered to other operators, or canceled, and the type today remains in service primarily with Delta and Hawaiian. A persistence of the old TWA lives on in the 757s that changed hands during the post-merger fleet churn. Many of the Boeing 757-200s that once flew for TWA and then American ended up in Delta's fleet when Delta grew its 757 fleet in the 2000s. Delta received a block of former TWA 757s in 2007 and integrated them after interior and system upgrades. If you like plane spotting details, Boeing offered the 757-200 in different exit configurations, either with 2 overwing exits per side or with a single Type 2 exit behind the wing. Many of the ex-TWA 757-200s in Delta service carry the door immediately after the wing and the Pratt & Whitney PW2000 engines. There was, however, a gentler way the TWA name re-entered the skies. American Airlines has honored its acquisitions with heritage liveries, and one of those tributes is a Boeing 737-800 painted in classic TWA colors, the TWA Retrojet. The airplane brings the look of the past into the present and has become a nostalgic crowd pleaser at airports and airshows. Side note, I flew the TWA Retrojet for my Delta vs. American economy battle video. If you want a first-hand comparison of modern economy on carriers that carry TWA's history, go watch that one after this episode. And for those who want to step inside TWA's past in person, the TWA Flight Center at JFK has been reborn as the TWA Hotel. Restored and reopened in 2019, the hotel uses Saarinen's iconic architecture as its centerpiece, houses a restored Lockheed Constellation cocktail lounge, runway side rooms, and a rooftop observation pool. It's a living shrine, a place where design, memory, and commerce meet, and one of the most visible proofs that while the airline's corporate existence ended, its cultural life didn't. The terminal's preservation and the hotel's success have created a pilgrimage site for aviation fans and regular travelers alike. In the end, TWA's story isn't just about airplanes or business plans. It's about ambition, identity, and how even the biggest names in aviation can fade when the world around them changes. Trans World Airlines began as a dream of connection, of crossing time zones, oceans, and cultures with style. For decades, it defined what air travel could be: glamorous, global, and ahead of its time. But by the turn of the millennium, the world it helped create had moved on. Deregulation, corporate raiders, and a new generation of low-cost carriers rewrote the rules, and TWA, the airline that once taught America to fly, became one more casualty of that shift.
Don't want to spend too much for business class or first class. All right, that's it for me. I'm off to explore Tokyo now, so I'll catch you in the next video.